If you were sentenced to death in the late 19th century, chances are you'd be led to the gallows. It wasn't pretty, but it was efficient. The condemned would stand on a platform, their head covered with a sack, to spare the crowd from seeing their final expressions. Then, the executioner would pull a lever, the trapdoor would open, and the criminal would either snap their neck or strangle to death. It was a grim spectacle, but it worked, except in one case, it didn't. This is the story of John Lee, a man whose execution was so inexplicably botched, it's gone down in history as one of the most bizarre events of Victorian England. And it all started on the morning of February 23, 1885, at Exeter Gaol in Devon. It was 8 a.m., and a crowd had gathered outside the prison, waiting for the sound of the bell and the sight of the black flag that would confirm John Lee's death. Inside, a small team, including the prison warden, a doctor, a priest, and a handful of guards, was preparing for the grim task. Lee, convicted of murdering his employer, Miss Emma Keyse, was led to the gallows by James Barry, a seasoned executioner. Barry worked quickly. He bound Lee's hands, placed a hood over his head, tied his legs, and tightened the noose around his neck. Then, with practiced precision, he reached for the lever and pulled it. Nothing happened. The trapdoor, designed to open cleanly and send the condemned plunging to their fate, had barely moved. Barry, rattled but determined, reset the mechanism. He untied Lee, removed the hood and noose, and tested the trapdoor himself. It worked flawlessly. He brought Lee back to the platform, repeated the process, and pulled the lever a second time. Again, the trapdoor refused to open. Members of the execution team exchanged uneasy glances. Some speculated the wood had swollen or the hinges had jammed. Guards fetched an axe to loosen the trapdoor, and Barry tried once more. The mechanism was adjusted. The trapdoor tested again, and Lee was brought back a third time. Hood on, noose tightened, lever pulled. Nothing. By now, the prison chaplain had fainted from the stress. The doctor declared the execution must be stopped, and the deputy sheriff agreed. A report of the morning's events was drafted and sent to London. The Secretary of State reviewed the account and, in an unprecedented decision, commuted Lee's sentence to life imprisonment. Thus, John Lee became the man they couldn't hang. Whether it was mechanical failure, divine intervention, or something more mysterious, his survival remains one of history's strangest tales. But who was John Lee? Our story begins in the charming seaside town of Babbacombe in Devon, a place that, at first glance, seems idyllic. But in the late hours of November 14, 1884, the peace of this quaint community was shattered by a gruesome and brutal crime. The setting of this horrific event was a modest seaside house belonging to an elderly spinster named Emma Keyse. That night, Miss Keyse came face to face with an intruder. It was clear she wasn't going down without a fight. She resisted, but her bravery would cost her everything. Her killer used a heavy instrument, likely an axe, to savagely beat her. If that wasn't enough, he took a blade and slit her throat with such ferocity that the knife left deep marks on her cervical vertebrae. But this wasn't just murder. It was an attempt to erase all evidence. After committing the heinous act, the killer doused both Miss Keyse and her home with kerosene and struck a match, intending to reduce everything to ash. Now, what makes this crime even more disturbing is that Miss Keyse wasn't alone in the house. Servants were sleeping nearby, completely unaware of the danger that could have easily consumed them as well. Authorities didn't take long to zero in on their prime suspect. A 20-year-old servant named John Lee had a troubled reputation, and for investigators the pieces fit almost too neatly. He was arrested almost immediately and charged with murder and arson. Back in the 19th century, the wheels of justice turned swiftly, but not always in the way you might expect. Under English law, serious crimes like this could only be tried by the Assizes Court, an institution shrouded in mystery. Every 3 months, these courts would convene, but what made them different was that the judges didn't stay put. They traveled from town to town, holding court in various cities across the country, hearing only the most horrifying and twisted cases. For John Lee, that wait must have felt both painfully long and shockingly short. The murder had taken place in mid-November, and by the first week of December, the trial was over. The evidence against him was damning. Witnesses testified that Lee had openly made death threats against Miss Keyse in the past. Adding to this, his own half-sister, Elizabeth Harris, someone he had once been close to, testified against him. The jury deliberated briefly before finding him guilty of willful murder. And then came the moment every condemned prisoner dreaded. The judge donned the traditional black hat, a grim symbol that signified the passing of a death sentence. With a cold and authoritative voice, he spoke these words: "The jury has found you guilty of willful murder. The sentence of this court is that you be taken to prison, and thence to the place of execution, where you will be hanged by the neck until you die. And then your body will be buried in the grounds of the prison in which you lay before your execution. And may God have mercy on your soul. Bring out the prisoner." With that, John Lee was transported to Exeter Gaol, a facility infamous in Devon as the hanging prison. For Lee, the days that followed must have been an unbearable mix of dread and resignation. His fate seemed sealed, or so everyone thought. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's pause for a moment and ask, who exactly was John Lee, and how did he end up in this horrific situation? To understand, we need to go back to the beginning. John Henry George Lee was born on August 15, 1864, in the small village of Abbottskerswell in Devon. His early life wasn't remarkable. There were no glaring signs of the darkness that would later define him. He was particularly close to his half-sister, Elizabeth Harris, and his older sister, Amelia. In 1878, it was Amelia who secured him a job working for Emma Keyse as a gardener and occasional butler. At first, the arrangement seemed to work well, but it wouldn't last. Lee left the job after just a short time to join the Royal Navy. However, his stint in the Navy ended abruptly in 1882. Officially, he was discharged on medical grounds, but rumors swirled that disciplinary issues played a part. Returning to civilian life, Lee found work in various hotels around Torquay, earning little and struggling to make ends meet. It wasn't long before trouble followed him. He was arrested and imprisoned for petty theft, a conviction that would haunt him. Upon his release, his half-sister Elizabeth stepped in to help. She persuaded Miss Keyse to give Lee another chance, and in the summer of 1884, he returned to her household as a gardener and butler. But this second chance was short-lived. Within weeks, Lee was caught trying to sell a guitar he had stolen from Miss Keyse. Most employers would have dismissed him immediately, but Emma Keyse was unusually forgiving. Instead of firing him, she reduced his wages as punishment. For someone like Lee, already bitter and struggling, this act of mercy might have felt like humiliation. Investigators would later speculate that this pay cut was the motive behind the savage murder that took place just months later. The question of John Lee's guilt or innocence is one that has haunted historians, skeptics, and true crime enthusiasts for over a century. Was he truly the cold-blooded killer who brutally murdered Emma Keyse? Or was he an unfortunate scapegoat caught in a web of circumstantial evidence? What's most remarkable about this case isn't just the crime itself, but what happened after Lee was sentenced. Still, let's examine the facts, or lack thereof, surrounding his guilt. First, the evidence against him was entirely circumstantial. Investigators had no eyewitnesses, no clear motive, and no solid proof. For starters, Lee often referred to Emma Keyse as his best friend in the world. Could a reduction in salary, however humiliating, really drive someone to commit such a gruesome crime? Many who knew him believed Lee wasn't the type to lash out so violently. Letters he wrote from prison painted a picture of a reflective, articulate young man, not a reckless, impulsive killer. Even more compelling was Lee's unwavering claim of innocence. After enduring a harrowing experience on the gallows, he never once wavered in his assertion that he didn't kill Emma Keyse. Through it all, from the moment he was arrested to the final moments of his life, he insisted on his innocence. If he was lying, he certainly had a remarkable commitment to the story, one that lasted until his last breath. But then, there's the other side of the coin. While it's true the case was built on circumstantial evidence, some of it is hard to ignore. For one, the alleged murder weapon, a bloodied axe, was linked to Lee. It was an everyday tool he used in his work, but why would he hand it over to firefighters unless he had something to hide? And then there was the kerosene. It was readily available in the house, and its use in the arson seemed almost too convenient. Perhaps most damning, however, was Lee's silence. Throughout his interrogation, he offered no alternative version of events, no theory, no defense. When police pressed him about the inconsistencies in his story, like how he injured his hand, he simply clammed up. Later, after his death sentence was overturned, he began accusing others, but all of them had airtight alibis. Witness testimony also painted a suspicious picture. Lee was the one who first raised the alarm, and at least one person claimed he mentioned Emma Keyse's death before her body was even discovered. But the details get stranger. Lee had cut his left hand, allegedly, while breaking a window to rescue a maid from the burning house. Yet, investigators found bloody handprints on the stairwell wall and the maid's nightgown, prints made by his right hand. Even the maid herself found his story dubious. She remembered hearing the sound of breaking glass only after she had been pulled from the house, not before. And then there's Lee's reaction to Emma's body. When authorities finally persuaded him to help move her remains, he claimed to know nothing about the injuries that had killed her. But if he didn't know, how could he have been so sure she was dead? The inconsistencies, the silences, the strange details, they all make John Lee look more guilty than innocent. But it's what happened next that would cement his name in history. The day of John Lee's execution was like something out of a nightmare, or perhaps a divine intervention, depending on who you ask. Lee himself believed that what happened on the gallows was an act of God. Before his execution, he claimed he had a dream, a vivid, almost prophetic vision of the gallows breaking down and failing to do its gruesome work. He wasn't the only one. Executioner James Barry, who had presided over many hangings, later recalled a similar dream from earlier in his career in which the gallows refused to function. But dreams aside, let's talk about the cold, hard facts. On February 23, 1885, John Lee was led to the scaffold at Exeter Prison, his fate hanging by a thread. The heavy door of the prison creaked open, and the air was thick with the kind of tension you could feel in your bones. As Lee stepped onto the platform, the noose was placed around his neck, and in that instant, it felt like the world held its breath. Barry, the executioner, stepped forward. His hand pulled the lever, and nothing happened. The trapdoor refused to budge. The rope dangled, the door stayed locked, and for a long, dreadful second, no one moved. A hush fell over the gathered witnesses. Barry, now visibly rattled, signaled to the team. They rushed to inspect the mechanism, fumbling with the hinges and gears in an effort to fix what had gone horribly wrong. They made adjustments, and after what seemed like an eternity, Lee was led back onto the platform. The noose was tightened once again. Barry, his face pale, pulled the lever again, and still nothing. The trap door remained shut, stubbornly refusing to budge. It was as though the universe itself was unwilling to let John Lee die. By now, the tension in the air was palpable. The executioners were visibly shaken. For the third time, the gallows were checked, all of the mechanisms inspected once more. The tension in the air was so thick, it could have been cut with a knife. Everyone in that room could feel it, the sensation that something was terribly wrong. Barry, desperate to avoid the embarrassment of an execution gone terribly awry, took one final shaky breath and pulled the lever. The crowd held its breath. The trapdoor didn't budge. It was as if the very gallows had refused to carry out the death sentence. At this point, even the most skeptical witnesses couldn't ignore the eerie sense of dread that hung over the scene. Was it an accident, Or was something otherworldly at play? The authorities, unnerved and completely thrown off course, did the unthinkable. They called off the execution. Lee, still alive, was led away from the platform, but the questions remained. What had just happened? Was it divine intervention, a simple mechanical failure, or something far more mysterious that no one could explain? Executioner James Barry later attributed the failure to technical problems. According to him, the scaffold was made of wood, and heavy rains in the days leading up to the execution had caused the wood to swell, jamming the trapdoors. He also criticized the construction of the gallows itself, saying the ironwork was flimsy and the trapdoors too thin. A Home Office investigation led by Mr. A.B. Hardy seemed to confirm Barry's suspicions. The committee found that one of the long hinges had rested on the latch, preventing the trapdoors from opening when weight was applied. Additionally, a prison official claimed the structure's iron bars bent under significant weight, which explained why the mechanism worked perfectly during tests, but failed with Lee standing on it. For John Lee, the failed execution wasn't just a stroke of luck, it was his salvation. His death sentence was commuted to life in prison, and he ultimately served 22 years before being released. But whether you believe his innocence or think he was the luckiest murderer in history, one thing is certain: the story of John Lee is one of the strangest, most compelling cases in British criminal history. The story of John Lee doesn't end with his miraculous escape from the gallows. In fact, the aftermath of his botched execution is just as fascinating and just as unsettling as the events that led up to it. After surviving not one, not two, but 3 failed attempts to hang him, John Lee's death sentence was commuted to life in prison. He spent the next 22 years behind bars, most of them at Portland Prison in Dorset. Then, in 1907, Lee walked out of prison a free man. What happened to him after his release is where things get murky. Rumors swirl about his fate, with some claiming he fled to the United States. According to this version, he lived under the radar in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, until his death in 1945. But no official records confirm this, and the precise details of his final years remain shrouded in mystery. For the officials involved in the botched execution, Lee's miraculous survival was an embarrassment of the highest order. The reaction was immediate and predictable: deny responsibility and point fingers. Letters flew between officials, witnesses, and prison staff, each one full of accusations, but lacking any real accountability. To their credit, however, the debacle did force the British justice system to modernize its execution methods. The archaic gallows that had failed to take Lee's life were replaced with new, state-of-the-art designs. These updated systems were faster, more reliable, and ironically far more humane than their predecessors. But the real game-changer wasn't just the equipment, it was the executioners themselves. A new generation of professionals like John Ellis and Albert Pierrepoint brought precision and expertise to what was once a grisly, unpredictable process. Britain's execution method had become so efficient that it was adopted by other countries, including Singapore, Malaysia, and India, places where the method is still in use today. The reforms may have restored dignity to the justice system, but they also ensured that no one else would survive the gallows the way John Lee had. Now, here's where things take a truly bizarre turn. While John Lee languished in prison, his mother was determined to secure his freedom. She enlisted the help of a lawyer from Plymouth, a man named Herbert Rose Armstrong. Armstrong believed in Lee's innocence and took on the case with zeal, even pushing it all the way to Parliament. But Armstrong wasn't the hero he appeared to be. In 1905, 2 years before Lee's release, Armstrong left Devon and moved to the quiet town of Hay-on-Wye in Herefordshire. There, he built a successful private legal practice. But beneath his polished exterior lurked a much darker side. By 1921, Armstrong had grown tired of his wife, Catherine. The solution? He laced her tea with arsenic and watched as she slowly succumbed to poisoning. It wasn't long before suspicion fell on him, and Armstrong was arrested, tried, and convicted of her murder. On May 31st, 1922, Herbert Rose Armstrong faced his own judgment day. He was hanged at Gloucester Prison with none other than John Ellis, the executioner who had perfected Britain's modern hanging method, pulling the lever. As the trapdoor opened beneath him, Armstrong uttered his chilling final words. "I'm coming, Kate." Unlike John Lee's failed execution decades earlier, this time the gallows worked flawlessly. The case of John Lee, the man they couldn't hang, stands as one of the strangest chapters in British criminal history. But it's the unsettling connections, like his lawyer's descent from savior to murderer, that transformed this story into something almost mythical. Was Lee truly innocent, caught in the gears of a flawed justice system? Or was he a cunning killer, spared by fate, divine intervention, or maybe something even darker? I'll let you decide. If you made it this far, thank you so much for watching. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoy stories like this one, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you don't miss the next one. Stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next video.